It's my pleasure to introduce Zach Hyrnowski. Zach is a senior education researcher at Gallup, where he leads several of the organization's largest education survey research efforts, including projects with the Walton Family Foundation and the Lumina Foundation. In his role, Zach conducts quantitative data analysis, authors, and presents reports to highlight study findings and advises during survey instrument design. He also contributes to Gallup's national higher education research and writes for Gallup News. Prior to joining Gallup, Zach served as a director of student programs at the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, where he was responsible for administering the organization's academic programming for university students and faculty. Zach received his bachelor's degree in political science from Northeastern University. Zach.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. I'd first like to thank everybody at the MHEC for the very kind invitation to be with you, and particularly to Chancellor Duffy for his recommendation, which I hope he will not regret following this morning's session. As mentioned, my name is Zach Hyrnowski. I'm a senior education researcher at Gallup, where I spend most of my time speaking with Americans and, more rewardingly, students, faculty, staff of universities and colleges across the United States to figure out what is it about the experience of a college education that makes their lives fulfilling, not only while they're enrolled in college, but after they graduate, the types of experiences that give them those great jobs, those great lives, and helps us restore faith in the value of this venture that we're all interested and committed to. What we've seen over the last decade or so especially is a reduction in confidence and trust in the American public in this institution of higher education. But what I'm here to tell you this morning is, while there's some truth to that, and there are certainly some red flags that we need to address and come to grips with, there are a lot of myths out there and things that are not necessarily as true as maybe you would be led to believe if you just listen to national dialogue about the state of higher education. So I'm going to go through some of those this morning. I hope we can have a little bit of discussion and Q&A towards the end, and talk about how this resonates, how it doesn't resonate in your states, at some of your institutions, etc. Before we get into every single detailed slide, because there are many, I just want to give us a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going today. And the first thing that I want to mention is that despite the fact that over the last decade there has been decline in trust and confidence in higher education, there's a little bit of progress that we've made in the last year. We've seen a little bit of a rebound in confidence, and we'll talk about where that came from and why that happened. But again, there's a little bit of a green light here, if you will, talking about the extent to which people are confident in higher education. But there are still concerns. When we saw those declines over the last decade, it was not just among those who have traditionally been less favorable towards higher education. It's been across the United States, age groups, political party affiliations, regions. So these are declines that are not just within certain pockets of the population. This is something that's been really pervasive, really across the United States. One of the analogies I've taken to using when I talk about this dichotomy and why there does seem to be this sort of clash of confidence and trust versus value is the extent to which Americans still value the product of higher education, the degrees that are conferred by colleges and universities. I have never, in my 6 years at Gallup, seen any indication that Americans' confidence in the value of a degree vis-a-vis careers and great lives is wavering. I've never seen any evidence of that. In fact, we see all of those either stay the same or increase in value as Americans recognize the importance of higher education to leading those great lives. But what they don't necessarily trust is the seller of those products. Universities and colleges, they believe that the cost of a degree is too high. They still value it. They still understand that what they get out of it is beneficial, but they're worried about the dollars and cents cost of attaining a degree, not only as it relates to the amount of money that it takes to do so, but also for many, the accessibility of college and university, the ability to get through the doors and reach that credential that they know would elevate them in their jobs and in their lives and in their socioeconomic standing. So we need to understand the perspectives of both of those, but I did want to just underscore at the outset, this is not going to be a presentation about declining belief in the value. It's going to be more about trust in the institutions that confer those degrees. Two sort of more topical issues, and these are things that we hear, and I'll get to the data on it, about why people are wavering in their confidence. Two of the things that come top of mind are politics and sort of trust in the leadership, a belief that campuses are, one, a good place for a diverse array of ideas to be discussed by all sorts of students, and that the institutions, the leadership, from the boards of trustees to the presidents and chancellors, et cetera, are doing the work of the students, not the work of the institutions. I have good news on the politics front, and I'll get to that, but the concerns about the extent to which campuses are being polarized and that certain heterodox views are being, if not discouraged, outright punished, is, from the data standpoint, when you talk to students, a little bit overstated, despite the fact that it's a really big concern for the American public. So I'll share sort of that little bit of myth busting, which, you know, hopefully some of you can take back to your states and talk about, you know, while this is a concern, it's maybe not quite as pervasive as one might think. But on the leadership front, and I have several metrics that I'll talk about on this, there is concern about the extent to which Americans believe that what I call the public good factor is still there, that colleges and universities are acting in the best interests of their students, their communities, their states, and not just trying to extract as many dollars in tuition and room and board as is possible. And that is something that we see concern with from the American public. We also see it from the students themselves, this sort of belief that their colleges aren't necessarily looking out for them to the extent that we hope they would. So that's a little bit of a roadmap. I'm going to go as quickly as I can through the data because it's Friday morning and I don't want to torture you all. But I hope during the discussion we can go back to maybe some of these slides or talk about, again, sort of that data that we're seeing. So talking about this general trend in confidence in the United States, as I mentioned, since 2015, Gallup has been measuring the extent to which Americans agree that they have confidence in the institution of higher education. And you'll notice that that green line there represents the percentage of Americans who say they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence. And in 2015, that was about 57% of Americans. Over the last decade, we've seen that crater, a decline of over 20 points in just 10 years, which in national, without getting into the methodology, I mean, this is a representative national poll, and this is not just statistical noise. This is a precipitous decline in American confidence. You'll notice that in 2025, this last year in June when we measured it again, we saw a 6-point rebound, which is encouraging. We don't know exactly why that rebound happened. There's some speculation that it could be because of the new administration, the perception that the federal government is coming in and switching some of those concerns that Americans expressed in the prior decade. It could be a little bit of noise, and I wouldn't necessarily put too much into that until we see that trend continue in subsequent years. So the main takeaway is that as recently as last year, you had as nearly as many Americans saying they had little to no confidence in higher education as said they had a great deal or quite a lot. And that's a concern not only at the top line level, but because of where, as I mentioned, these declines are happening. It's not just among those who did not attend college themselves. It's not just among Republican identifying Americans who historically have always been less favorable towards higher education than Democrats and even political independents. You'll notice that that decline, while they end in different places, the declines have been almost uniform, where Democrats, independents, those who have a college degree, have all become significantly less confident in the institution over the last decade, to the point where last year, less than half of adults in the United States who themselves have a bachelor's degree, who have engaged with higher education, did not have a great deal of confidence in the institution. So again, as I mentioned, this is not an isolated, we need to just find this one group that's lost confidence and restore it. This is across the board. I do think it's important to put this in context, because if you look at all of the other institutions that Gallup measures confidence in, higher education is at or near the top. There are three: the military, small businesses, and science, which typically lead the way, and those have remained very high, while many others have cratered. So if you look compared to even things like medicine, public schools, so K-12 schools, certainly all of the government, you are well outpacing Congress still, so if you were concerned about that, there's no need to be. So in the rankings, higher education is still at or near the top. What that means is in some ways, you all are fighting against this sort of miasma in society where Americans are just losing confidence in all of the cornerstone institutions, and that is true. But one thing to note is that in prior years, we typically saw higher education sit a little bit above the fray, in the same way that the military, for example, also sits above the fray. We see declining confidence in government, but not so much in the military. Higher ed used to be that way, but in recent years, it's sort of been lumped into this overall, everything in America is going in the wrong direction, and higher ed is part of that. And so while some of that confidence, as I'll get to, is that those declines are maybe misplaced, it does not remove us from the fact that we are battling against this general, feeling of decline and disillusionment with some of these really big institutions in the country, and we need to separate out and demonstrate that higher education is not in that same boat with all of these other institutions that Americans don't trust. We did ask a follow-up this prior year when we asked, how confident are you in higher education? If you have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence, why is that? And the three main reasons are in that green table on the left. The primary reasons are Americans still, again, recognize the societal and individual benefits of higher education. We know that an educated society is healthier, it's more prosperous, it's more innovative, it's more civically engaged, there's more volunteerism, all of those good things. And Americans continue to recognize that. They also recognize the exposure to different people, cultures, ideas, views, that is a good exercise to go through. And then finally, just general belief that the institutions in the United States, the faculty, what we do, the research is second to none in the world. So those are all the reasons that people say, yes, I still believe in the value of higher education. Of course, there's the 1 in 3 or so Americans who say they don't have very much confidence in higher education, and we also ask them why that is. And as I previewed, the primary reason that people say I do not have confidence in higher education is something related to politicization on campus, liberal indoctrination of students, increasingly diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. That is the primary reason that Americans cite if they do not have confidence in higher education. Followed by what I think is more important in some ways and has more truth to it if you ask the students, which is the concern around whether schools are teaching the right things, whether the curriculum is aligned with the job market, whether young people who graduate with this credential and likely paid, in many cases, quite a bit for it in real and opportunity costs, that's going to lead to the right jobs. And while students are more confident maybe than the American public, I think this is something that we need to remain hyper-focused on because it is a concern that students often raise themselves. And then finally, as you might expect, cost, loan burdens, that continues to be a pervasive concern. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that might be and maybe some solutions for that. So the rest of the time I'll sort of get into the details of each of those 6, hopefully. And the first thing that I want to highlight before we get there is, despite the concerns about confidence and belief in the institutions themselves, we have not, as with value, seen a cratering of the number of Americans who either want their children, if they're parents, to go to college, or if they are children themselves, to want to enroll after high school. So you'll see that when asked of parents in June, thinking about your oldest child, what is it that you hope that they will do after high school? About 6 in 10 parents say that they want their child to either go to a 4-year or a 2-year institution. Many of those who want them to go to a 2-year institution then hope that they progress into that 4-year degree. So if you want to just think about the propensity of parents in the United States to want their child to go to college, this is still right around that 60% mark. Very few, you'll notice, only 6% want their child to go straight into the workforce. There are many, 16% or so, who want their child to go into some type of a job certification, training, vocational, industry certification program, something like that. And that is a trend that we have seen on the rise, to the point where when we ask adults, how much do you value each of these different types of credentials, bachelor's degrees, associate degrees, industry certifications? In recent years, we have seen U.S. adults placing almost commensurate value on industry certifications as they place on bachelor's degrees. I think one of the things that we have not highlighted as much is the connection between those two things, where oftentimes an industry certification is only valuable in conjunction with a bachelor's degree, but there is an increasing perception out there that we are measuring that you can just go get an industry certification without a bachelor's degree and do just as well. So we are seeing interest in this. Of course, many of those credentials are valuable in the industries that they're offered in, but you are starting to see more Americans say, you could just replace a bachelor's degree with certification for a quarter of the cost and a quarter of the time. So that is something that we're battling against. I also do work with Gen Zers in coordination with the Walton Family Foundation. So that is Americans born between 1997 and 2012. So this is more your traditional college-age population. And just with, as we see with parents, when you ask students themselves, what is it that you want to do right after you graduate high school, we see the similar trend of about 6 in 10 young people who are currently enrolled in middle school or high school saying, I would like to, if I could, go to college after I graduate. There aren't a lot of places where we see differences in trends based on the region that you live in. So typically, if you're asking about quality of schools, enrollment trends, and all sorts of different life goals, we don't really see that many differences regionally. This is one place where we see a little bit of a difference among young people in the Midwest, where they are slightly, the young people in the Midwest are slightly less likely than their peers nationally to say that they hope to pursue a 4-year degree after they graduate. And I know I was talking with Chancellor Duffy about this. This is something that if you were to look at enrollment trends regionally, even though we've seen an increase nationally coming out of COVID for the first time, we've seen that trend sort of turn around. It may be that the Midwest is lagging a little bit in that, and we do see that. So if we believe that, you know, the COVID crisis was the main driver of declining enrollment and that this will rebound, certainly in the Midwest, there are some indications that maybe young people in this region in particular are a little bit less likely to want to enroll after high school, and we may not see that kind of organic return to college that you would maybe expect to see if you were just looking at the national numbers. So I did want to flag that for you all. But overall, one final trend from our work with the Lumina Foundation, interest among all U.S. adults, and I use that term very, very intentionally, has never been higher in terms of what we have measured at Gallup in terms of interest in pursuing any type of credential, whether that be a certificate or a certification, but also bachelor's degrees and associate degrees. Now, where does a lot of that interest come from? It's not from your typical college-aged population. It's not just from the 18-year-olds. We see similar levels of interest in pursuing bachelor's degrees and associate degrees from U.S. adults over the age of 25. Now, many of them have barriers to entry that look very different from an 18-year-old, childcare concerns, needing to work, needing flexibility in their schedules. So there are a lot of barriers to entry for that group. But if there's any belief out in the audience that, you know, we don't have as many people out there in the country right now who are interested in pursuing higher education as we did maybe 5 or 10 years ago, that's just not true. It's only been on the rise. What the issue is the ability of many of those adult learners to access the system, to go and obtain a degree in a reasonable amount of time for a reasonable cost, while also contending with all of the realities of adult life. So despite that decline in confidence, we don't see that corresponding decline in interest in enrollment. So let's talk a little bit about cost and value. As I mentioned, when we measure this with the Lumina Foundation, these are data from our most recent survey in 2024, even though we just came out of the field with 2025. So if you're followers of the Lumina survey, we should have more of those data in the coming months. But back in 2024, when we measured the relative value of credentials, as I mentioned, you know, graduate degrees, bachelor's degrees, industry certifications, we see about 70% of Americans who believe that one of those credentials is extremely or very valuable in general. It's about 9 in 10 Americans who say at least some type of post-secondary education is valuable. And I'll just highlight again there, though, that industry certifications are catching up in relative value to bachelor's degrees, and I think that's a conversation that, again, as an industry, we're going to increasingly need to have. One more time, when you look at this on a regional basis, I'm highlighting this intentionally because we don't see that difference, and I think there is a perception, and we certainly see it among the young people, a little bit among parents in this region, concerns about the value of higher education in terms of accessibility, interest. Is there a shifting paradigm that you don't need to go to college? We have not yet seen a decline in this region in terms of how much the Midwest values higher education versus the Northeast or the West or anything to that effect. So we've not seen that yet. That may be a leading indicator, and I take solace in the fact that even though there's a little bit less interest maybe in enrolling among the young people, that it's maybe not due to value, which leads me to question, and there's more work to be done on this, why is that they're less interested in enrolling? Is it because they see it as less accessible? Do they see differences in the industries and jobs that are available here that they're not tying directly to a college degree? There's more to be done, but it's not strictly on the fact that there's a difference in belief in the value of credentials in the Midwest versus the rest of the country. And most of that happens to come from the perceived value of a credential or some type of post-secondary education, in particular here to a college education, not just an industry certification, so the types of jobs you can get after college. We've asked this item, I think every year on the Lumina survey, about the value of college vis-a-vis 20 years ago. Is a degree more important, about as important, or less important today than it was 20 years ago to getting a great job? And what you'll see here is, again, pretty consistently for the last 4 years, about 3/4 of Americans say that a college education is at least as, if not more important, to getting a job today than it was 20 years ago. And so when you think about that generic value question, how valuable is this credential versus that credential, a lot of the value does stem from that very direct correlation between getting a college education and getting a good job, which leads to a great life. The good news is when you ask the students, do you think that the degree that you're working towards, that you're enrolled in, is going to lead to a good job? Generally speaking, I would say the answer is yes. If you want to look at the most conventional way of just, do you think it's going to help you make enough money to live comfortably, to live a good life, what I think is the typical measurement of a good job in many cases, that's almost 90% of students who say, yep, I'm confident that the program I'm enrolled in is going to get me a job that pays the bills. More importantly, though, they believe that it's going to get them a job that they love, that they're passionate about. And this is one of my hobby horses. I was talking about it at dinner last night. I think one of the things we do very poorly in some cases in measuring outcomes for students after graduation in terms of their careers is not only does it pay a living wage, but is it something that you're passionate about? Because at Gallup, we know that having a good job that gets you up and excited in the morning, like the one that I have, has very important knock-on effects for the rest of your life. You're more likely to be physically healthy, to be mentally healthy. Of course, there are the financial considerations. You're more likely to be engaged in your community. So getting a job that not only pays a good salary, which I don't want to undermine the importance of that, is only one piece of the puzzle. There's also this component of getting into a purposeful, meaningful career. And the good news is, again, most students believe that their degree is going to lead to that, even actually a little bit more than they believe it's going to pay the bills. And what I always like to do is to flip over to this slide and say, that's true irrespective of major program of study. I think there are tropes out there that we've all probably heard of, well, yeah, it's great if you go and get a degree in engineering or chemistry or something like that, and you'll go off and do fine. But if you're getting a humanities degree or a liberal arts degree, you're in trouble. We've never seen that when we ask students. The humanities students are about as confident as those who are in technology or engineering. These are all, probably somewhere within the margin of error, or at least statistically comparable, but at the bottom are the natural sciences and the business students, which is surprising to me. But I would say what you should take away from this chart is most students, regardless of their major field of study, are confident that their degree is going to lead to a good job. The flip side, right, so if we've talked about value and the continuing belief in that value, and I know PSEO is going to probably do a much better job of sharing, sort of the actual dollars and cents value after this presentation. The generic belief in the value is still there, and the numbers do bear that out. As I mentioned at the top, though, there's still a lot of concern about pervasive cost issues, the extent to which Americans believe that what colleges are charging to their students is fair. And on that side, we do see that students, prospective students, Americans who have never enrolled, pretty uniformly flag this as an issue. Less than 1 in 5 Americans think that four-year colleges and universities are charging fair prices to their students. By the way, that is also true of 20% of bachelor's degree students, the students who are actually paying their tuition right now. Only 20% of them believe broadly that four-year degrees can be acquired at a fair cost. Two-year colleges, as is often the case in many of these metrics, if you think about trust, confidence, two-year colleges often get much better marks from the American public than four-year universities, but even among two-year universities, you see that it's a minority of Americans who think that even two-year colleges charge fair prices, despite the fact that many of those degrees are far, far less expensive than a traditional bachelor's degree. Now, that being said, one of the working theories that we had at Gallup when we were doing this was, how well do Americans actually understand the cost of college? We know that they don't think the prices and the costs are fair, and there's, you don't want to undermine that because for many people, perception is reality. But there is this important question of, do Americans understand what it costs to go to college? I remember, I think it was probably 2 or 3 years ago at this point, there was a big story in the New York Times about how Vanderbilt's annual cost of tuition was about to eclipse $100,000, and that got a lot of run. And in many cases, I think it sucked up a lot of the oxygen in the conversation about what does it cost to go to college. This huge $100,000 sticker price was top of mind for a lot of people. But the reality is that's not the experience for most students. So we asked Americans to kind of estimate, and we didn't even ask them to estimate out of the clear blue sky. We gave them a starting point. We said, on average, the cost of a four-year degree at a public flagship university is about $25,000 for in-state students. Now, that's the sticker price. How much do you think that the average student going to that college actually pays? The answer is $15,000, so the net tuition cost on average nationally at a four-year university, a four-year public university, is about $15,000. We found that only about 17% of Americans, after all of that prompting, were able to get within $5,000 of the actual annual cost of tuition. What was really interesting was half of them actually underestimated, and that might just be because we were giving them a little bit of prompting, and about 1 in 3 overestimated by at least $5,000. The main takeaway is people are very, very bad in the public at understanding the actual cost of college. And I've been in a lot of rooms like these, and you all are smarter than the average bears, so I don't think this would be you, but I've heard other folks in these types of conversations say, everybody knows nobody pays the sticker price. Yeah, what's on the brochure, but everybody knows that. Unfortunately, literacy about the actual cost of college is very low in the United States. And so we as an industry, I think, need to do a better job of communicating, helping people understand the difference between net tuition and sticker price, the actual cost of college at something that's not Vanderbilt or the Ivy Leagues, that accessibility is far different for 90% of students than what is portrayed either in the media or just in the general consciousness about the cost of college being on the rise. That matters because when we ask a follow-up question, knowing what you know now, that the actual cost that students pay is often far less than what's advertised, does that make you personally more likely to want to enroll in college? And about half of adults said, yes, knowing that the cost is actually far less than what I thought it was previously makes me more likely to want to pursue it. And again, that's true not only of traditional college-age students, that's true of working adults and other non-traditional students. So this message to me is very important to figure out how we communicate this better to the public, to help them understand that yes, the cost of college has nominally been on the rise, but if you were to look at real tuition costs over the last decade, they've actually stayed stable, if not declining relative to inflation, and there are a lot of options out there for you if you are somebody who wants to access college. In many cases, cost is not as significant a barrier as maybe you perceive it to be. But even that being said, and all of that, I'm trying to do like a little bit of a sandwich here on good news, is even with these pervasive concerns about cost, when you ask adults, do you think the investment that either you are making, if you're a current student, or you could be making if you're not currently enrolled, pretty significant majorities of Americans say that they believe that investment, be it higher than they think it should be, is still worth it because of that payoff, because of the benefits and the value that they understand a degree confers. So about 90% of students who are currently enrolled in 4- and 2-year degree programs say that the investment they are making right now is worth the cost. And about 2/3 of Americans say that if I did make an investment in a 4-year education, that would be worth the cost. And that's even higher, about 80% of students who were previously enrolled and 70% of adults who have never been enrolled in higher education to say that an investment in a 2-year degree would be worth the cost. So again, this dichotomy is really important to understand when we're thinking about confidence and perceptions of higher education. The value is still there, even with the high costs, but there is still that issue of cost that we need to sort of get under control. I won't spend too much time on this because it's a little bit in the weeds, but another illustration of this belief in the value of higher education is that most adults believe that a degree pays off within 5 years. Again, even considering all of the investment in tuition, about 6 in 10 Americans think a college degree pays off within 5 years, and about 86% think it pays off within 10 years. So if you're thinking about messaging, if you're a traditional college-age student who enters at 18 and comes out at 22, most adults, 86%, think that that degree has paid for itself or you've gotten enough value out of it by the time you're 32. And of course, for most of us, we're going to be working far longer than that. And after that, it's all just net benefit. So Americans believe this, and this is the only time that I will wade into something that PSEO is going to do much better. But we actually used national data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from the census, to kind of figure out when does the average bachelor's degree student break even, considering not only the cost that they're paying for tuition, but also the opportunity cost. We know that many students are not working, and if they are working while they're enrolled, they're not working to the fullest extent that they could be, and they're giving up wages and salaries. When I work with the Gen Zers that I mentioned earlier, many of these 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are saying, I don't want to go to college, say, I'm looking at some of my friends who graduated a year or two ago, and they're already out there in the workforce making $60,000 a year. That sounds great. For some students, it's a necessity. It's, I need to get out into the workforce and start making money to either support myself or to support my family. So this is a very real concern. And for many, it's a barrier. But even considering the opportunity cost of those wages that you aren't earning in the first 4 years if you're getting a bachelor's degree, and the tuition that you're paying, the average bachelor's degree graduate breaks even financially 8 years after graduation. So that's about in line what everybody thinks, so that's good. The perception aligns with the reality, but I think it's very important to note that it takes 8 years on average to recoup all of these costs. And again, we can have a conversation about costs and all of that, but the value is there, and it's there relatively quickly in the scope of the entire working life of the average U.S. adult. And you know, for many of us, 30 years of our earnings are just going to be, you know, net above and beyond what you would expect to earn at a high school graduation, vis-a-vis a high school graduate, and that happens 8 years after graduation. By the way, the same is true of a 2-year degree holder. It's about 8 years for that 2-year degree to pay off. Last thing, and then we'll open it up for what I hope is a robust discussion, is this issue of campus climate. So as I mentioned at the top, the primary reason that Americans say they're not confident in higher education is related to something along the lines of it's too political, liberal indoctrination, conservative students can't speak freely on campus, DE&I is running rampant. When you ask the students themselves, that's not really the case. So this is a representation of currently enrolled 4-year bachelor's degree students, and we asked them a whole host of questions, but the one I've selected here is a pretty simple. At my institution, I can express my opinions freely. Now, what we find is about 3/4 of students, just over that, agree that they can express their opinions freely, which of course means about 1 in 4 students are not comfortable expressing their opinions freely on campus. So there's some truth that not all students feel comfortable talking about politics and other divisive issues on their campus. But what you don't see, if you go to the very bottom of the chart, where we've split it out by political party identification, is a really big difference in this perception based on the party ID of the student. So Democrat students are not significantly more likely than independent or Republican students to say that they feel comfortable expressing their opinions on campus. We do this at the national level. This is a representation of students across the United States. We also do this work with individual institutions, many of which have been compelled by their legislatures to run campus climate surveys to assess the state of free speech on campuses in places like Tennessee and Indiana. Every time we've done this work at the institution level, we see the same trends, that yes, there's a certain amount of hesitancy among some students to speak out on their campus, but we do not see patterns on the basis of party identification. Far more often, what we hear students tell us is, this is just a politically rancorous climate. I just don't want to speak publicly about it because it's a politically fraught conversation. Some students are just never going to be comfortable talking about politics and religion around strangers. And so while there are definitely concerns, and I would love for all of those bars to be 100%, I feel comfortable expressing my opinions on campus, what we don't see, at least to the extent that I think it's discussed in the national zeitgeist, is this big divide between the comfortability of some students and the comfortability of others, and those heterodox views on campus being suppressed. So the last slide I'll get to, and this is my favorite one, I've saved it for last. It's unfortunately a bad news story, so maybe it isn't my favorite, but it's a question that we started asking about 3 years ago of students, of alumni, about the extent to which they believe that their institution is making decisions on their behalf, in their best interest, because we saw all of these other metrics and they were all good. Students believe in the value, they think they're going to get a good job, and yet we saw some slight declines in things like likelihood to recommend their university to others if you use Net Promoter Score, and some other high-level metrics that if you were a president or a board of trustees, you would be a little bit concerned about. And we were trying to figure out what was behind it, and one of the theories we had was it's not actually an indictment of the degree, it's an indictment of the school that they're going to. And so we started asking this question, and what we found was only about 6 in 10 currently enrolled bachelor's degree students even agreed that they believe that their institution, when it makes decisions that affect students, is doing so in a way that considers and advances the best interest of the students, not the institution, which of course means that 41% of currently enrolled bachelor's degree students don't think that their institution is acting in their best interest. So that is something that the first time I saw it was pretty shocking to me. This is a number that I focus on very heavily and that I try to drive in a positive direction and understand what's behind that. How can we as institutions, how can we as an industry start moving this in the right direction? Because I think if we move this number in the right direction among students, and we have more students that say, I showed up at my institution, my university from day one took care of me, they were focused 100% on making sure that I was successful, that I was having a good experience, so that when I graduated, I went out and I had the best life that I could. Those students are going to tell that to their parents, they're going to tell that to their siblings, their cousins, their friends, their coworkers, and that's going to start to rise, or that's going to help the tide of confidence, belief, and trust in this institution rise and counteract that really significant decline that I showed in that first trend. So if this is something that we deem important, that turning confidence around in the industry is an important thing for us to do, this is a number that I would focus on. It starts with the students. Let's start helping them understand that public education still is a public good, and that'll help us turn around this kind of decline that we've seen in the last decade or so. So with that, I know we're a little bit early, so I don't know how much time we have for discussion, but I would love any reactions, questions.
How about questions? Yep.
Yeah.
You mentioned the 8-year break-even number, and I think that's a good number, but how thick and how long is the tail on the high end? And just to give an idea of how many people are going to be at the 10-year or 15-year or never?
Yeah, that's a good question that I don't have the answer to right in front of me. It's certainly one that I can get for you. This is based on just national averages, and so we found that we weren't breaking it down by major field of study. Part of that is because in the census data, we don't necessarily know what adults studied. So we don't necessarily know, are there some graduates of college that wouldn't expect to break even for, say, 20 years? We also don't necessarily know how much they paid in tuition initially. So this is all just based on national averages of tuition and things like that. There's absolutely going to be variance. But I could check for you if there are any more granular levels based on either tuition or fields of study. PSEO might actually even be able to. I use their data all the time, and they're, for my money, the best source of that right now. But of course, it's opt-in, and not everybody's represented in it, so there are some limitations. But just based on the national census and BLS data, it's going to be 8 years.
Tim Fleckel.
Student loans, which you kind of nudged in, its cost and everything. I wish someone, because I've tried to find it, but there's no breakout ever on what is actually education related and what is lifestyle related to those costs. Because when I look at the percentage of students that go, Pago or whatever for spring break, and they have the newest and best phone that are better than anyone has in this room sometimes, we get chastised for the cost of education bundled within that lifestyle choice. Have there been any efforts to disaggregate what is actual education and what is just, they would have done this anyway kind of costs?
That's an interesting question. It's not one that we've measured. Typically when we ask about loan burden, it's just generally how much have you borrowed to obtain your degree at whatever university that you're attending. We don't even break it out by tuition versus room and board versus incidentals and spring break trips. But it's an interesting question. I don't know because we've not asked that. There may be someone else in the room even who has a better understanding of it. But when we ask about loan burden, it's typically limited to just the generic, how much have you borrowed to obtain your degree?
Any other questions? Yep, Emily.
I have a question. I can't find the hand signal. This is Barbara. The 8-year that we're talking about, in the research I've done, it also depends on what major you choose. If you're choosing, say, engineering, computer science, it's less time for you to recoup because you are paid so much initially. What's your comment on that?
It's a good point. And again, I promise PSEO didn't pay me, but one of the things that they do is share salaries at sort of that 1-year mark, the 5-year mark, and the 10-year mark. And typically what we see is in some of those industries that you're talking about, certainly STEM being the primary example probably, those students are commanding very high salaries very quickly after they graduate. And especially if you put it up against a humanities major. But what you usually find, especially at the 10-year after graduation mark, is a lot of those humanities and social sciences majors have actually closed the gap pretty significantly between some of those other majors that you see commanding those high salaries right after graduation. So if you look at it that way, yes, there are certain graduates that are going to be, and that's going to of course be incorporated into this 8-year trend. Would you see that be a little bit faster? Maybe would a student who graduated with let's just say an engineering degree, pay off those loans and recoup that opportunity cost more quickly than a student who studied English? Yes, you would almost certainly see that on average. But by the time you reach that 10-year point, you would have seen the salary gap close pretty meaningfully. And of course, even then, even if we assume that that English student is maybe recouping their costs 10 years or 11 years or 12 years after they graduate, a traditional age college student or graduate would then be 34, 35, and would still have those 30 years where everything after that is net benefit. Everything that it costs you to get that degree has been paid off, and for the next 30 years, this is just the benefit and the fruits of that degree. So it's a good point that there are differences in the speed with which you recoup those costs, but we see pretty consistently across all sorts of majors that, college pays off, and it pays off in fairly short order in the overall scope of how long the average college graduate would be working over the course of their lifetime.
Mr. Chair, can I just ask another question?
Sure. You're the past chair, or you're the past chair now.
Oh, well, thank you. In terms of your survey, who are you actually surveying about? Do you know, are you surveying those that went to college, those that did not go to college, or they have someone in their family that's first generation. Because I think that has a lot to do with what you think of as the value. If you pull yourself up by your own bootstrap, then you don't see the necessity in having it. And if you're not from a family that had degrees, then there's not an importance on that. I'm at the University of Kansas, and this is something we deal with, frequently. So can you do a brief breakdown of who you surveyed?
Yes, great question. So in that presentation that I just did, I had a little bit of a hodgepodge of several surveys. Where most of the data came from was our work with the Lumina Foundation, which is a study every year of about 15,000 US adults. About half of them are currently enrolled in college. About a quarter of them were previously enrolled, so they enrolled in some type of post-secondary education but didn't complete it, so they stopped out. And about a quarter of them have never enrolled in higher education. So we do have the ability to look at attitudes on that basis. As you would expect, students who are currently enrolled and pursuing, and even to an extent those who have stopped out prior to graduating in a program, are a little bit more likely to value or be interested in pursuing higher education than someone who's never engaged with the system. Now, that being said, we also do surveys of alumni, so college graduates, and we also do surveys nationally, irrespective of sort of your prior enrollment, but we do know some of those characteristics that you mentioned, like first-generation students. What we find often, actually, sort of counterintuitively, and it's not going to be universal, but we often find that those first-generation students are actually more likely to value and say that college is important than someone who has a degree. And we also see the same of parents who don't themselves have a college degree in terms of what they want for their child. There are a lot, nearly on par with those parents who themselves have college degrees. There are a lot of parents who don't have a college degree who want their child to go, and that is especially true in communities of color. Black and Hispanic parents are more likely than white parents to want their children to go to college, oftentimes because they themselves, in some cases, were not able to attain those degrees. But also there's, I think, a differential in certain communities, especially those of color, that I see in the data in terms of how much education is valued, especially as that sort of ladder up to the best possible life that you can achieve. So you're right that there are absolutely differences in some communities, whether it be based on race, ethnicity, your actual first-generation college student status, et cetera. And oftentimes it's actually more valued in communities that don't have access or themselves did not attain a college degree than parents who did go to college.
Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation very much.
Thank you very much.
I can tell this is very popular. We've got a queue here, just to tell you about how it's going to go. Emily, Maureen, Beverly, and then Tammy.
We have a speakers list. I love it.
Great. Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions, one which you kind of touched on already, but goes back to the very popular slide on the earnings data, the 8-year return. First is, do you see variation by demographics and the length of time that it takes to, earn back what those costs? And then two, how do we make that data really resonate with students? Because you're a high school student, you're about to enter the, and make that fork in the road decision. Saying 8 years down the road you're going to break even, and I don't know if that's going to really resonate.
Right.
And so I think we have an opportunity here with folks in this room, both because of that gap in folks who see a bachelor's degree as something that they want to earn, to change the narrative. But I'm just curious as how we make that resonate, because it's very wonky. We might understand it here, but I don't know that they will.
I mean, we could probably have a whole conference about the difficulties and maybe the irresponsibility of allowing a 17 or an 18-year-old to make decisions about taking out like $200,000 in loans, hoping it'll pay off down the road. I agree, and it's something that I mentioned we're fighting against. There are students who see, I could be making this amount of money the day that I graduate from high school, and helping them conceptualize it is something that you're absolutely right, is a challenge. I think from a messaging standpoint, giving students the opportunity to learn and earn, I think I've heard that, I don't know, someone else came up with that, but I went to Northeastern, and I had the ability to work in a co-op program while I was enrolled and actually was paid and paid fairly. So incorporating more opportunities, I think, for students to not have to make this choice between do I work or do I go to school. A lot of that, and again, this is why we could have the whole conference about it, is that does require institutional buy-in. It requires flexibility from institutions to either offer coursework and class slots that are outside of the traditional, class hours that would allow more students to work, to not have to make that decision. Because for some students, it's not even a decision. It's, I can't afford to wait. Even if they accepted our premise that this will pay off in 8 years, in 8 years, their family is, on the streets. So I think there are a lot of factors that's going to matter based on the student's individual circumstances, and I could see many of them, even if they bought our argument, not being able to sort of engage with it. I do understand, though, and I'm up against it with sort of these 17 and 18-year-olds saying, I can't really conceptualize or think 8 years down the road. That's half my life. That seems a lifetime away, and I just have to start earning right now. Especially with some of the conversation. I know the data don't bear this out, but there is, I think out in the national conversation that college doesn't pay off. You're going to pay $200,000 and you're going to be making, $35,000 a year because it doesn't lead to a good job. That's not true, and that's another component, I think, of maybe not talking about this in the 8 years versus 5 years versus 10 years based on what major. I think that the message is college does pay off. It is, and always, as long as I've been doing the research, the best, most reliable pathway to a great life. We probably need to come from a variety of fronts to help, students who are 17 or 18, their parents, who are oftentimes one of the biggest influencers of that decision, helping the entire ecosystem understand the benefit and the payoff that we know exists. I mean, that's the whole ball game, right?
Maureen.
Thank you for your presentation. And this is great information, great data, and you have the majority of it is on the 4-year. There is some 2-year in there, but it would really be helpful and I think informative to have information on the 2-year degrees, as well as, you mentioned that, your experience with learn while you earn kind of thing. The 2 years are looking at apprenticeships very closely now, and, any information in that arena would be certainly helpful for that population.
It's an incredibly important point, and one that actually I'm happy to say is something we're working on remedying. We're going into the field with a survey of alumni, which we've always done for the last, I think, 15 years or so, surveying college graduates. That's traditionally been focused on 4 years. This year we are pulling a big sample of 2-year college graduates. So we're going to have a little bit more knowledge and information about the experience of 2-year college graduates, and are they living those same great lives and getting those same great jobs as we've seen for the 4-year. So we are working on improving sort of the degree to which we can measure those students and those graduates. To your point about apprenticeships, in the work that we're doing with the Walton Family Foundation, we're doing a lot of exploration of interest in alternatives to college pathways. So not just a 4-year degree, but are you interested in things like apprenticeships or internships or sort of these alternative pathways? What we find, probably unsurprisingly, is there's a lot of parents who know next to nothing, if anything at all, about anything other than a 4-year degree program. Partially that's because it's what's talked about most by college counselors or school counselors in K-12. There just aren't a lot of resources right now for parents. But when you ask them and you tell them, would you be interested in a program like an apprenticeship, or even if you don't say the word apprenticeship, but you just sort of define the program itself, there is a lot of latent interest among parents in those types of programs, and students, by the way, who say, this is a really attractive path to me. I don't really know anything about it. I don't know if it exists in my community, and if I did, I wouldn't know how to get that information. But there are a lot of parents who look very favorably on those types of programs and would take advantage of them if they were available. Of course, we know that apprenticeships are, much more prevalent in Europe, and I think they're making their way here. I know the current administration is actually focusing on how we might expand that apprenticeship pathway a little bit in the United States. But, this is something that's absolutely attractive because it does mitigate in some ways that trade-off of, I don't really understand how sitting in a classroom for 4 years and never sitting in an office or on a work site is going to translate into my post-graduation jobs. We know that it typically does, but the outcomes that we see are much better for students who, for example, report that they had an internship while they were enrolled in college. Those students have outcomes in the workplace even beyond the average college graduate. So finding more opportunities to do that, I agree with you. The community colleges do this in a much more organized and successful way than four-year colleges. And by the way, that bears out. I didn't want to inundate us with, well, you might disagree. I probably inundated you with data, but I could have inundated you more with trends nationally that do break out 2-year versus 4-year. And we find that that confidence trend, that was asked just generally about higher education, it really represents 4-year colleges. This last year we broke out and asked about confidence and trust in 2 years versus 4 years. Americans are significantly more likely to trust 2-year institutions and be confident in them than 4-year institutions. So there is this enduring belief among the public that community colleges are still embodying that sort of spirit of being a public good. It's right in the name, right? We're in the community. We know the types of jobs that are in our region or in our town or our county or our state. And people understand and make that connection still. There are certainly concerns that adults have about, is an associate's degree going to get you the same type of job or quality of job as a 4-year degree might get you from an earnings standpoint, but there is still a belief far and above that that we see among 4-year universities in terms of how confident people are and how much trust and goodwill there is towards the community colleges in their states.
Beverly.
So this has been great. Excellent information. When you're talking about the difference between getting the degree and not, do you have any data that talks about those that did not get that degree and how they are feeling and what their data points are for economics 8 years out? And I asked that question because I still have seared in my memory that I went to college and I had an old car and it broke down in my hometown. And the people that didn't go to college had brand new Firebirds and they zipped by me pointing and laughing because they had this brand, and it felt horrible at that point in my life that I'm struggling at this point and they're doing very well and, all of that. Well, when you reverse this now, I know the difference, but are we able to tell our youth what that difference is?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So first on the 8-year number, that is in direct comparison to a high school graduate. So we're baselining and saying, if you didn't go to college, if you just graduated high school, what would you expect to earn and when do you? That 8-year break point is, to put it a little bit more verbosely, the point at which a college graduate surpasses the earnings and makes up the costs that a high school graduate did not pay for college. So that 8 years, you basically earned back everything that that high school graduate earned and did not pay, and everything after that, you see that gap widen between the lifetime earnings of a college graduate and a high school graduate. And a lot of that also builds in assumptions about upward mobility and the extent to which you are continuing to get raises in your salary, which we know is more accessible for a college graduate than a high school graduate. You're far more likely to run into an income ceiling if you're a high school graduate than if you're a college graduate. So in some ways, we might actually be underestimating with our assumptions the lifetime earnings gap between a college graduate and a high school graduate. When you look at other metrics, and I know I'm talking a lot about income and salary, in a lot of ways, those are my least favorite metrics to talk about. I would much rather talk about things like purposeful work, well-being, both mental and physical well-being. And if you look at all of those metrics, we pretty consistently at Gallup see that if you put a high school graduate up against an associate degree holder or a bachelor's degree holder, the high school graduate is far more likely to report poor mental health, to report poor physical health outcomes. They are about half as likely, often less than half as likely as college graduates, to say that they're in a job that they like, that they wake up every day with purpose and enjoy what they do. That, of course, translates to, your relationships with your children and in your community. So on what I think are even the more important metrics, I think the salary and income and the types of issues you're talking about. Do you have $500 in your bank account to cover an emergency? I mean, those are really important, and I think they're incontrovertible. The numbers bear out that you're far worse off if you don't have a post-secondary education. But also, I think important in that conversation is just the quality of life outside of that. And a college degree, the numbers in that way also bear out to a T that you are going to live what I would call a great life. You're far more likely to live that great life if you go to college than if you do not.
Last question is going to be Tammy DeVote from Wisconsin.
Good morning. I really enjoy your presentation, and you kind of got this question from Emily, but I really enjoy seeing the data. I love data. I'm so interested in how, it shapes my thinking so much. I feel really lucky that I get to come to events like this where I'm getting this data like broken down for me. It's what I continue to think, okay, this is the best route for students and families. I work exclusively in financial aid right now. So every day I'm working with financial aid administrators, a couple hundred of them across our state of Wisconsin, and then students and families. And just recently came off doing some volunteering for FAFSA night. So I'm like talking with people, and I always I don't struggle myself to articulate how important and valuable I believe a 2-year and 4-year degree. And in Wisconsin, we also, by the way, as an aside, have such great data from our 2-year technical colleges that reinforce a lot of what you're saying. They've done a great job sharing that with the public. But the messaging question, like, what are your suggestions? I know you're a data guy. I know you're, you have all it in front of you. What is your best recommendation for us working in higher ed professionally, and also, of course, in our private lives, talking to people and really trying to share the good message about the value of any type of higher education?
Saved an easy one for last, huh, Mike? What's the message that's going to turn the tide? I really do think, again, if it were me, I think the message, there's probably a difference between what resonates with the public and what resonates with me personally, having seen all of the data. My favorite data, and I didn't necessarily go into it too much because of time constraints, but we have a lot of data at Gallup around just the great lives aspect. And I think I bring up my sister, who I didn't think she was going to go to college. I told the story at dinner last night, not because she isn't smart, but because she just didn't really know what she wanted to do in life. She didn't have that passion where she said, like, I want to be a doctor and I'm going to go to college and I'm going to go to med school and all of that. She was in high school, and she, on a whim, I think on the recommendation of a teacher of hers, because she wasn't really sure what courses she was going to take the following year, took a mythology class. And she loved that mythology class so much that she started thinking about how she could do that in college. She went to UNH, got a classics degree, went and got her master's degree, and now she's a Latin teacher, and she could not be happier. Is she ever going to, raise the income ceiling on the, earnings numbers? No, probably not. But she could not be happier with her life, and the only way to that pathway was, one, teachers who cared about her in high school and helped her understand, one, do you want to go to college at all? And two, if you do, why do you want to go? And when she got there, she had faculty members that supported her, that mentored her, that she's still in contact with now many years after her graduation, who helped show her that pathway. And now she lives a great life. But all of the components that go into that, if you want to look at it, we've done this work with our alumni survey, we've done it with currently enrolled students. The difference in a college education that is great and leads to a great life and that graduates tell us was incredibly fulfilling is often not related actually to any of those job numbers. It has to do with questions like, I had professors at my institution who cared about me. I had a mentor. I had an internship. I was able to find my passion while I was at college. So it's not necessarily a message to students. I think it's what we need to do because, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen declines in sort of the likelihood of college graduates to recommend their experience to others. And the message can come from us, folks who work in the industry and can talk about the dollars and cents. I think the message that's going to resonate the most is someone like my sister telling her high school students, this is what college did for me. It was an incredible life-changing experience. It had set me on the path that I went down and that I'm so happy on. And it can do it for you too. So I think in many ways, we are limited in our ability to make that message land. We can equip people with the data, but it's the students themselves, it's the parents of the students who say, my son or my daughter went and had this college experience and look at what they're doing now. The more people that are telling those positive stories and not the stories of my daughter went to college and now she has X amount of money and student loans and hasn't found her purpose or a great job yet, those are the stories that stick and detract from the value, even though we know on average it's not true. So equipping more of those students who have had the experience and graduated to communicate the message we hope that will land with future students, I think that's going to be much more important than anything that we put on a brochure or even in my reports. Not that I have any like illusions that people read them, but if you are that person, I don't know that it's going to change the minds and the hearts as much as the students themselves talking about that life-changing experience.
So I just have a quick follow-up. So that really resonates with me. In the past, we used to have guidance like from Lumina. They had Goal 2020, Goal 2025, and they would arm us with these things to go out and kind of be the messengers for some of this information. And so like you're forming my thinking. We're talking about in Wisconsin creating this college access network and some of the things that we need to do. And you just said something that was so important, and I'll keep that with me. But any other ideas on any type of national campaign or places for us to go to help in that type of work? And thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. I agree. Lumina is, they're a client of mine, a lot of these data. I think they do a tremendous job. They have a lot of resources. Their Stronger Nation work. They've just set their new goal around, the percentage of Americans who should have some type of, I think the term they're using is credential of value. So not just college degrees, not just 4 years, not just 2 years, but certifications. They've set a new goal. They're my go-to resource in terms of sort of like the national goals of what do we want our society to look like from a national post-secondary attainment lens. So I would definitely recommend them and, the Courtney Browns of the world and the Chris Mullins. I rely on them a lot for that messaging. And in some ways, they're probably better equipped because I'm wonky and I talk about data points. And I equip Courtney to put out really the smart messages about like how we convince Americans to reach that threshold of, I think it's 65% of adults with credentials of value. So I think you're already on the right track with Lumina for sure.
Well, it sounds like we might have more than a few states that might be inviting Zach to come visit and talk to some stakeholders. I know that we've done that in Ohio with our Ohio Trustees Conference, and it has resonated with trustees as they start to reflect upon the mission of the institutions in this changing environment. So please join me in thanking Zach.
Thank you.